If you've ever looked inside an off-the-shelf PC, you'll likely recognize one of these. The Intel boxed cooler derives its name from the fact that it is boxed with Intel's locked CPUs. If Intel provides these coolers with their CPUs, surely that would mean it's sufficient, right? If you're working with a locked CPU, is there any real reason to upgrade to an aftermarket cooler? Before we begin our comparison, it's important to understand the difference between locked and unlocked processors. Many of Intel's high-end consumer-grade CPUs come in two versions, locked and unlocked. You can tell which version of the processor is unlocked by the inclusion of a K at the end of the processor name. For example, an i7-7700 is locked, an i5-6600K is not. Locked CPUs, as the name implies, have a boost frequency that is locked in place. You can almost think of this as a rev limiter on your car. Unlocked versions of CPUs are almost identical to their locked counterparts, but can be overclocked beyond their rated boost frequency. Generally speaking, there's no real harm in overclocking your CPU, provided that you can keep it sufficiently cool. The more you overclock it, the more heat it's going to generate. For this reason, the unlocked processors do not include the boxed cooler because it would not be sufficient enough to keep a processor cool that has been overclocked beyond its rated boost frequency. The main takeaway here, if you buy an unlocked processor, it's implied that you're going to provide your own aftermarket thermal solution. Today's discussion focuses on the inverse of this scenario, or in other words, adding an aftermarket cooler to a locked CPU. Is there really any benefit to removing the boxed cooler and applying a bigger, more expensive cooler? In order to test this, we would need to come up with a worst-case scenario. For this reason, we are using the Dell XPS 8700. This is an off-the-shelf PC that is notorious for its overheating problems. All things considered, this is a pretty formidable pre-built machine. This sample comes with an i7-4770 with 12 gigs of RAM and a toasty R9 270 as a graphics card, and it's all enclosed in a very restrictive micro ATX case. Things are exacerbated by the fact that only a single fan header can be found on the motherboard. That's right, there's only a single 90mm exhaust fan desperately trying to eject hot air out of this case. To this end, Arctic graciously provided me with a review sample of their Freezer 33 tower-style cooler. The box includes a large cooler with 4 heat pipes leading to 49 aluminum fins, a 120mm PWM fan, a plastic mount to attach to the rear of the motherboard, several screws and brackets for compatibility across Intel and AMD processors, 4 mounts for up to 2 PWM fans, and a sufficient supply of thermal paste. Generally speaking, one of the most time-consuming parts of any PC build is the installation of an aftermarket cooler. Many times manufacturers will include lots of extra parts to ensure that their cooler can work across many different chipsets. That's great and all, but that means the end user is going to have to do a lot of reading to find out which parts apply to them and sift through a lot of extra little pieces that most of which are not actually going to end up using. This Dell motherboard, despite its flaws, actually made things extremely easy. There's a permanent mount attached to the back of the motherboard that the Intel cooler screws into. Thankfully, the Arctic freezer included hardware for just such a scenario, making this the simplest installation of an aftermarket cooler I've ever experienced. Despite this case not having a cutout behind the motherboard, technically this cooler could have still been installed with the motherboard still inside the chassis. The only unconventional part of the installation was the unusually suggested application of thermal solution. I personally used the tried and true pea-sized blob method, but this technique seems to have worked just fine. But let's get to the testing. It was important to get a baseline for how the computer functions exactly as it would off of a shelf from Best Buy. Idle temperatures didn't indicate anything particularly concerning. Internal temps were about 27 degrees Celsius, with the GPU at 35 and CPU at 43. To get a true worst case scenario, I ran the Prime 95 benchmark on the CPU and the Furmark benchmark on the GPU in order to make that Radeon card sweat. The GPU peaking at 84 degrees, internal temps just in front of the CPU cooler were about 32. The most telling part of this test, however, was the CPU temperature itself. Throughout the duration of the test, the CPU was running right at 90 degrees Celsius. Technically, the thermal limit for this CPU is 105, but the CPU doesn't want to get anywhere near there. Somewhere between 90 and 100 degrees Celsius, the CPU begins to thermal throttle, or in other words, it won't try as hard in order to preserve itself from overheating. We saw evidence of this in the performance metrics. Although the processor was still able to operate mostly at 100% capacity for the entirety of the test, many jagged dips and valleys right under that 100% mark were definite indications of the beginning stages of thermal throttling. All readings basically returned to the same pre-cooler swap idle temps, with the internal temperature hovering at 26 degrees C and the GPU back at 35. The CPU, however, increased to 47 degrees Celsius. At first, this may seem counterintuitive. Why is the bigger, more expensive cooler making the CPU hotter than the boxed cooler? Well, remember, these are at idle temps, and it makes sense once you understand the nature of the semi-passive cooling design of the Freezer 33. Heat will dissipate passively off of those aluminum pipes and those 49 aluminum fins without any assistance needed from that fan. Of course, this is going to contribute to higher idle temps, but the trade-off is a 100% silent operation under light loads, and of course, longevity added to that fan. But how does the picture change once we begin to heat things up? Well, that's where things get interesting. I expected to see a measurable decrease in temperature, but a 17% reduction down from 90 degrees to 75 degrees was a welcome surprise. Not only that, but the GPU temperatures decreased as well, a 5% decrease from 84 degrees down to 80. I can only contribute a more efficient direction of airflow to this unexpected result. Likely the downdraft style of that Intel cooler spread the heat unilaterally in many directions before eventually finding its way to the back of the case where it was exhausted. With the tower style cooler oriented parallel to the exhaust fan, now we have cold air coming in through the front, being passed over that CPU cooler, and then immediately exhausted out the back before having the opportunity to come in contact with any other components. An internal temperature decrease of 13% substantiates this hypothesis. This experiment demonstrates that a better cooler is only part of the story. Efficiently routing warm air out of the case as quickly as possible also has a tangible effect on thermals. Now, we knew from the beginning that replacing the boxed cooler with a bigger, more expensive thermal solution would obviously result in better thermals. But that wasn't the question. The question was, is it worth it? Is there any reason to do that? While I can't speak for every possible scenario out there, for this test case, yes, absolutely. Unlike the jagged and insecure performance graph observed by the stock cooler, the Freezer 33 helped the CPU operate at 100% capacity with rock-solid stability and without any signs of throttling. While this likely doesn't translate to any noticeable increase in real-world performance, this does represent a much healthier CPU that is likely to continue to run well for many years to come. Not to mention, if you decide to upgrade to an unlocked CPU down the road, this cooler will be able to handle the increased thermals introduced by an overclocked processor. My recommendation to you would be to conduct some thermal testing of your own. There are also many things you can try to help your thermals without actually having to spend a dime. Make sure your intakes are unobstructed. Don't store your PC in an enclosed area, as this will result in warm exhaust air being sucked back in. Keep your PC off of the ground to prevent it from sucking up dust and clogging intakes. And periodically clean out the interior of your case in order to keep it running as efficiently as possible. If this still isn't enough, or if you need some thermal solution that will handle an overclocked processor, then the Freezer 33 is one of many very good options. MSRP for this cooler is $45 US, however it can currently be found on Amazon for less than $30 by following my affiliate link in the description below. Thank you guys for watching. If you found this video insightful or otherwise enjoyable, then consider giving it a like. Also consider subscribing so you know when future content is available. I run giveaways every month, and one of the requirements for these giveaways is always to subscribe. If you want to know the giveaway is going on right now, follow the link in the video description and you'll be able to find out. If you're interested in other content that we've released recently, check those videos out here. We've reviewed other computer components such as graphics cards, and also peripherals such as keyboards, mice, and headsets. Some of those I'm giving away, so if you want to hear my take on that content, check those videos out. Like and subscribe, share, and I will catch you guys in the next one.